Hello, dear friends. Today we will continue our journey through Otto Carius's memoirs. In this part, he will interact with the Waffen-SS division. It will be quite interesting to learn his opinion about these military formations. Don't forget to leave your opinion about this material and support this video with a like. Well, let's begin. Old Fritz. We were happy when we finally reached Narva. It was assumed that the new positions would be well fortified and reliable enough to hold back the Russians. There were no barracks there because the entire area around Narva was filled with retreating troops. So we looked for a place to stay with other units to warm up a little. In the meantime, I went in search of the crews of 2 damaged tanks. They had obviously also arrived in Narva. Ready for any surprises, I took 2 cans of good pea soup with me. I imagined them standing somewhere, shivering from the cold and hungry. Since we were going against the flow of traffic, it was very difficult to make our way east. We found both of our tanks at the railway station without any problems, but we didn't see any of the crew. We had to literally comb through the houses one by one. And then, I couldn't believe my eyes. My hungry and frozen crew were sitting at a table set as if in peacetime. They were eating cutlets and all sorts of other delicious dishes that the hostess kept serving them. My appearance with cold pea soup was greeted with warm welcomes, and of course, I joined the more lavish meal without hesitation. It was clear that people needed a long rest and a comfortable bed. Their most cherished desire was to sleep, sleep, sleep. But as always, things did not go as they wanted. We were heading west on the highway. It was already dark, and we had covered about 20 kilometers when suddenly the announcement came, "Everyone to the right! Oncoming traffic!" We stopped and saw a Tiger tank struggling to make its way through the oncoming traffic. When I stopped it, Senior Sergeant Pz.VI got out of the tank and gave me the good news. I didn't have to go back to the train. He had brought the rest of the company with him, and I could immediately go into action with a full complement. Then we headed east with our 4 Tigers. Sleep and a bed were just a dream. Pz.VI had no idea about the details of our mission. He only knew that we had to report to the commander of the SS division, which had to hold the bridgehead at Narva. We were tormented by uncertainty all the way to Narva and crossed the bridge built by our sappers. There was an atmosphere of excitement in the air. In the city, we saw only SS vehicles scurrying back and forth. It was not easy to find the division's command post because most of the men in the Nordland Tank Grenadier Division were from Scandinavian countries and had difficulty understanding German. But almost all of them were tall, energetic young soldiers. They were commanded by SS Brigadeführer Fritz von Scholz, whom I immediately nicknamed Old Fritz. I finally found him at a peculiar command post in a bus. I parked next to a nearby house. It was the only divisional command post I saw during the war that was closer to the front than the regimental command posts. I reported to the officer on duty, who was in the second bus, my rank, position, military unit, and, as usual, I have arrived to report personally to the general. The Hauptsturmführer then looked at me with interest, as if I were a creature from another planet. "To the general," he finally said, emphasizing each syllable. "To the general? We don't have any of those here. You are in the combat units of the SS, if you are not aware of that. And we have neither sir nor general. Here, apparently, there may be a brigadier without sir, if you wish to meet him. Furthermore, the title sir is also absent from the names of all other ranks, including Reichsführer." I was not prepared for such a reception, but immediately changed my tone. "I would like to report to your Brigadeführer." The officer on duty nodded. "That's better," he said in a somewhat condescending tone. "Wenger, Go and ask the Brigadeführer if he has time for Mr. Lieutenant Karius from the Tigers unit." He felt it necessary to place a noticeable emphasis on the word Mr. before my rank. Meanwhile, the Untersturmführer got up from his workstation and disappeared with the words, "Yes, sir, Hauptsturmführer." Soon he reappeared. "The Brigadeführer is waiting for you." I entered the command bus and was completely astonished after everything that had preceded it when I saw a man who was the embodiment of serenity and cheerfulness. During my entire time at the front, I rarely met any other division commander with whom I could compare our Old Fritz. He was completely in solidarity with his troops, and his subordinates idolized him. He was always there and accessible to everyone. During our time working together, he treated me like a son. So it was a heavy blow to all of us when we later learned that our Old Fritz had been killed in the Narva sector. He was awarded the Knight's Cross with Swords in August 1944. But what did that mean to those of us who had actually lost our frontline father? When I reported to Old Fritz on the bus, he immediately patted me on the shoulder in a friendly manner. "Well, why don't we drink a schnapps to our future work together?" he said, poured 2 full glasses, and clinked glasses with me. "Where are you from?" After my answer, our conversation continued in a family-like manner. I shared my first impression of his troops. When I got to the part about how I was received by the officer on duty, he laughed. "Yes, that's how it's done here. At first, I had to relearn a few things myself when I was transferred here from the army. I had mixed feelings about it. But now, I wouldn't want to part with these guys under any circumstances. These guys in the Waffen-SS are just extraordinary. They have a camaraderie that you probably won't find anywhere else. But if it were possible, and also so that you know, I like it when someone addresses me as General. If you are a product of the old school, like me, for example, then such an address will be more natural for you." Then we talked about the situation. During the conversation, it became clear that my skepticism about the legendary Panther defensive line was once again confirmed to an even greater extent. Old Fritz explained to me, "You see, to be precise, this line of defense exists only on paper. At this time of year, it is, of course, completely impossible for our comrades to hold their ground on the front line. There are probably still a few bunkers left in the vicinity from the time of our offensive, but they are usually not located where they can be used. In addition, the Russians are advancing faster than expected. To top it all off, our troops have become so accustomed to constant retreats that they have already broken through the lines that needed to be held. We wanted to form a front line on the bridgehead indicated on the map, but discovered that the Russians were already there. So I organized a new defensive bridgehead. Your task will be to lead the way and help the troops advance to the best positions in their sectors. These positions will then need to be fortified and held. Since the Russians only have small advance guard units in this area, it should not be particularly difficult to push them back, thus allowing my soldiers to fortify their front line. Thus, my task was clearly defined. In carrying it out, the SS and I were supported by artillery, which we had brought in from Leningrad. Without this support, the front at Narva could not have been held for months. Our tanks were located near the division command post east of Narva. From the south, the front stretched to the outskirts of the city on the eastern side of Narva. There, after a short distance, it crossed over to the western bank of the river, where the front line was clearly marked all the way to the point where it ended in the Baltic Sea. The relatively calm times soon passed. The Russians threw more and more forces at our bridgehead. Soon they brought in heavy and super heavy artillery and unleashed a furious barrage of fire on the city. Thanks to the brave SS defenders, the Russians failed to break through the bridgehead. Only the road bridge caused me concern. The Russians kept it under constant artillery fire. It remained the last crossing over the Narva River after the railway bridge was destroyed. If it had been destroyed, we would have been trapped with our tanks and unable to use them on other sections of the front. I outlined the situation to Old Fritz. He agreed with me to place my tanks on the west bank of the Narva, on the other side of the bridge. In an emergency, we could always be in position in a matter of minutes. Then I drove back across the bridge. I was looking around for a suitable staging area for my vehicles when I heard the sound of an engine approaching from the front line, a car with a Corps flag. It stopped immediately, and I couldn't believe my eyes when Field Marshal Model jumped out. The High Command had ordered him, as it always did in hopeless situations, to go to the Northern Front to restore order. I reported what was required of me, and then a storm broke out over me, the likes of which you rarely see. Model's eyebrows twitched. I had seen this before on the Central Front. I wasn't even allowed to explain or say anything in response. I went to my men and instantly found myself on the other side of Narva. The field marshal gave me an order that I will never forget. I hold you personally responsible for ensuring that not a single Russian tank breaks through. None of your Tigers must be put out of action by enemy fire. Every barrel is precious to us here. As for Field Marshal Model himself, he did not allow any compromises, but he was lenient towards the frontline soldiers who adored him. He demanded nothing for himself. In the Ruhr pocket in 1945, I heard his characteristic reply, "There are 24 hours in a day. Add another night to that, and you will probably finish your work." Unfortunately, our tour with the SS Nordland division soon came to an end. We continued to cover the sector for several more days until the SS secured their new positions. In the process, we managed to relieve them of 4 anti-tank guns. I will never forget the wonderful guys from the Nordland division. They fought like lions. They were more familiar with Bolshevism from their own experience than many in the West were from their thick books. Later, I discovered that many of the Kurland army, due to the difficult circumstances, ended up in Sweden, believing that this would save them. Among them were those who fought in the 3rd SS Panzer Corps. They were later interned, but under pressure from the Allies, they were handed over to the Russians. Considering that even at that time relations between the Western powers and the Soviets were not exactly cloudless, and that the West was well aware of the fate that awaited people arriving from the Baltic states, the Swedish government's decision becomes even more dishonorable, as a decision of a country where people so often and willingly talk about the Red Cross. The Estonians, Lithuanians, and Latvians who served in the SS were put to death, or, at the very least, sent to Siberia, just as their parents and grandparents had been before them. There are shocking reports of what happened in Swedish internment camps when word reached them that their inhabitants were being handed over to the Russians. Suicides and self-mutilation are terrible material evidence of the guilt of the so-called host country. People who took up arms against Bolshevism only to defend their homeland, Western civilization, and, as part of it, Sweden, were doomed to certain death. A new assignment awaited us between Narva and the mouth of the river. The Russians changed the direction of their main attacks there after retreating from the Narva bridgehead. They tried to break through the frozen Narva and create a bridgehead on the west bank of the river. The main attacks were focused on the village of Rigi, located on the west bank of the river, halfway between Narva and Balti. Wengler's long-suffering infantrymen were stationed there. They made use of an old trench left over from the 1941 offensive. On February 16th, I was sent to Colonel Wengler with 2 tanks to support his men in defending against massive Russian attacks from across the Narva. Wengler's command post was located about 2 kilometers behind the front line, separated from it by swampy forests. The colonel welcomed me with open arms. "Finally, you're back! I'm just happy they sent you, because we already understand each other well. The situation here is very complicated, but you already know that. Unfortunately, I suffered heavy losses during the retreat. The combat power of my regiment is, at best, equal to that of a single battalion. In order to hold my sector, I need at least a whole regiment, if not more. For this reason, the front line is poorly held. I tried to build a series of strong points as a backup. It would be best if we could survey the situation on the ground as soon as possible. You will get a better impression than if I show you the whole situation on a map." We immediately set out on a reconnaissance mission. Such reconnaissance also helped us to orient ourselves at night. The level of combat activity was quite high. When we arrived at the battalion command post, Wengler was informed of another Russian breakthrough. The Russians suffered heavy losses during their attacks because they had no cover whatsoever while crossing the Narva River on the ice. But even if a small group managed to gain a foothold on our side of the Narva, they would cling to our trench system like leeches, and we would have to drive them out with counterattacks before the next wave of attacks could roll in. It was quite clear that the Russians were determined to achieve their goal here at any cost, and without regard for losses. We had to support the infantry in expanding the territory of the occupied trench sections. This required a high degree of accuracy so that our own troops would not be hit by our fire. We had to get within about 50 meters of the trenches, which ran in a regular zigzag line. From there, we watched our soldiers advance. When they occupied a section, the first one would wave his hand. Then we fired at the next 10 to 12 meters of territory with our 88mm guns until it was ready to be stormed. As soon as our soldiers' helmets appeared above the edge of the trench, we ceased fire and our troops captured the trench. Our team worked with precision. The Russians were unable to add this success to their list of achievements, despite heavy losses. But they immediately responded to the appearance of our tanks with artillery fire, sending us a solid number of their welcome greetings. The eastern bank of the Narva River dropped off quite steeply, and the edge of a huge wooded area stretched along the hill. Our positions were clearly visible from the edge of the forest, and we were like a thorn in the side of their artillery, which caused us a lot of trouble. Less than 3 minutes after we left our patch of forest, the first flashes appeared from the gun barrels on the far bank. Only by moving around and maneuvering constantly were we able to avoid being hit directly. I focused all my attention on the far bank, while Pz.VI provided support to the infantry in his vehicle. And although I silenced several Russian guns when I entered the fray, we found ourselves under fire again every time we reappeared. During one of these skirmishes, I finally taught Lustig, one of our drivers, to temper his inherent recklessness. Usually, this bundle of energy only spurred me on if my vehicle was out of action, but his tank commander often told me that Lustig was an unbridled man who always rushed forward and was difficult to persuade to back down. Undoubtedly, a characteristic of a man worthy of praise, if not for his disregard for danger. In his civilian profession, Lustig was a blacksmith, a guy as healthy as a fire hydrant. Once, when a lit cigar fell under his shirt, instead of tearing off one piece of clothing after another, which is common in winter, and pulling out the cigar, he simply extinguished it by pressing it against his bare body from the outside. When we shook hands, I felt as if I had been kicked by a horse. That was our Lustig, a man with his heart in the right place. He always drove the car forward, never stopping in front of the enemy. But once, as I said, he learned to temper his ardor. We were about 500 meters from our small fishing line when the Russians opened fire. The first volley fell short, the second fell behind us. I didn't want to wait for the third, as the probability of being hit was too high. I shouted to Lustig, "Reverse!" But he didn't react. We remained where we were, and the Russians fired a third volley. The shells began to explode around us, and one of them, a 28-centimeter giant, landed right in front of us on the trail. But it didn't explode. Like a big mouse, it rolled quickly and easily toward us, sliding across the snow under our vehicle. Later, we saw it in front of the forest on the way back. After that incident, even our friend Lustig became convinced that there was no time to lose when I gave him the command to reverse. Again and again, we marveled at the quality of our tank's steel. It was hard, but not brittle, and elastic. If an anti-tank shell did not hit the armor directly, it would slide off to the side and leave a mark behind, as if you had run your finger over a soft piece of butter. At night, we couldn't help our long-suffering comrades. Our shots would only put them in danger. We simply opened fire on the ice-covered Narva as soon as the Russians launched a new attack. By doing so, we partially diverted the Ivanov's artillery fire onto ourselves. The Russians often tried to cross the river, up to 10 times a night. They even used sleds. Despite huge losses, they strove to force the river. When they did so, we called it stubbornness, and when we did, we called it bravery. After the war, we became very familiar with the reversal of such expressions. A soldier who had done his duty for his country to the very end was suddenly labeled a militarist and a warmonger, in short, a vicious Nazi. After things calmed down a bit in the Riga sector, we received a new order to march. I asked Colonel Wengler for leave, and when we wished each other luck, he shared with me, somewhat embarrassed, that he was probably facing the most difficult and longest battle of his life. He was getting married. An opportunity arose that allowed him to tie the knot, namely, his award of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, for which he was returning to Germany. He became the 404th soldier to receive this high award. Unfortunately, his early marriage was short-lived. Wengler, already a major general, was killed in 1945 in the West after being awarded the Knight's Cross with swords. He became the 123rd Wehrmacht soldier to receive this award. That's all for today. If you liked the video, please support it with a like and subscribe to the channel. See you all soon.